Good morning, everybody. Yes, as Natalie said, I'm, I suppose, just still newish managing partner of the firm, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all here this morning to our Built Environment Conference. The healthy turnout is really great evidence, actually, if it was needed, of the importance of this sector to our firm. So it's fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for supporting the event. The health, or otherwise, of the property sector and the built environment, it has a huge impact on our society and on our economy. And our ability to effectively deliver housing and critical infrastructure of all categories, it has a massive impact on both social cohesion and on the competitiveness of the Irish economy. And when we think of the property sector and built environment, some people might think just simply of bricks and mortar, but as we all know here today, it's much more than that. The theme of our conference today, Planning and Building for Tomorrow, that sort of captures a lot of the complexity and the difficulty in the property sector. We're going to hear this morning about how technology is impacting and changing a lot of the traditional approaches in the property sector. We'll learn about the impact of the new planning and development legislation, and we'll have a discussion about the perennially hot topic of the delivery of residential housing. But huge investment is needed in our built environment if the country is going to remain competitiveness, is going to be critical to the next phase of our industrial and our economic growth. And we're in danger of stalling, if not actually going backwards on the development of the nation at this stage. It's so critical if we don't address a lot of these topics. So I'm really looking forward to listening to the discussion, and I hope that you'll gain some insights here this morning as well. So thank you very much and look forward to this morning's sessions.
Thank you, Will. And as Will said, welcome to Planning and Building for Tomorrow, a conference organised by Mason, Hayes and Curran. My name is Colm Lyons and I'm a journalist with the Currency. And I'm going to be moderating the event today, helping and facilitating today's panellists as they discuss and debate arguably the most important issue facing our country today, property. I've also been tasked with ensuring the event runs on time, something that could well be as difficult as solving the housing crisis itself, given the standards of some of the speakers we have today. Over the course of today, our panellists will be addressing a range of topics, from the potential of PropTech to the new Planning and Development Bill to housing delivery. And as Will said, this conference could not happen at a more opportune time. Depending on what politician or indeed economist you talk to, Ireland is either making progress on addressing the crisis, or the crisis is getting worse. Either the policies being proposed by the government are making things incrementally better, or they're making little difference. And the ultimate real-world answers to the questions and the efficacy of the policies being implemented by the government or being proposed by the opposition will have huge consequences for Ireland, its politics, its economy and its people. It's the single biggest issue facing Ireland today. Over the course of the day, we're going to be discussing some of the challenges facing us and what we think can be done to solve this crisis. But we also intend for today to be as interactive as possible, so you can ask the panel questions and answer our poll questions, as well as access speaker bios and the event agenda via our conference app. Hopefully, you may already have accessed the app by now, but if you haven't, just need to scan the QR code, which is in the centre of your tables, or will be coming up on the big screen behind me. And this should bring you to the conference homepage, where you'll be able to participate in polls and learn about the various speakers. But before we begin, and in order to understand how this room feels about the property market in Ireland, if you look into the app, you can press the polls and questions button, and we're going to just take a look at what is our first question today. And this is, please choose from the list 3 changes in order of priority you think would have the biggest impact on boosting supply in the housing market? Number 1, streamlining planning. 2, lower interest rates. 3, new government. 4, increased grants for home buyers. 5, no VAT for residential development. And finally, government-funded infrastructure programme. That's the poll question, and we're going to reveal the results of our poll throughout the day. Now to begin, I'm joined by 2 economists, well known to all of you, to set the scene and lay some foundations for the various panel discussions today. I'd like to call to the stage Ronan Lyons, no relation, but and also Colm McCarthy, who have both traced the status of the Irish property market for many years and bring a wealth of experience and insight to the subject. Welcome Ronan and Colm.
Thanks, Tom.
Just to kick things off, could you give us a bit of an overview of whether you think things are getting better or worse, or at this point, do we even know?
Things are getting worse at a slower rate. That's an optimistic twist on a pessimistic outlook. The reason I say that is fundamentally how many new homes, and I'm thinking this from a housing perspective rather than wider real estate for the moment. How many new homes does the country need per year, and how many are we getting? Because to my mind, as long as we're undershooting on that, things are getting worse. Now, if we need 50 to 60,000 homes per year, which is what I believe, and we have been building 20,000 a year, then to me, it sort of follows that things are getting worse, not better. Our backlog of unbuilt housing is getting bigger. Now, what I would say is that we went from building 20,000 homes a year to 30,000 homes. So we're still adding to the backlog, but it's much better than if we were still only building 20,000 homes per year. Of course, the real question is how many homes are going to get built in the next few years. Will we even match the 30,000 we got last year? Probably not. But everything else follows after that. Until you understand the scale of homes needed and the fact that we're still lagging the true social need. This is not market demand, this is the social requirement. That to me says that things are getting worse, albeit at a slightly slower pace.
And Colm, they call economics the dismal science.
Yeah.
Are you feeling dismal or a little optimistic?
Well, I want to draw a distinction between the commercial property market and the residential side. Things are looking a little bit flaky in commercial property right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if some lenders were a little bit nervous and all of that. But it's clearly cyclical. We've had upswings and downturns in commercial property before, and I'm kind of content to say, well, it looks a little bit difficult for a while, but it'll sort itself out. The ordinary forces of supply and demand are permitted to work more or less in the commercial property market. They've been suspended in the residential market. I'll give you an illustration. In 1988, that is 35 years ago, the politicians had managed to crash the public finances, and we nearly ended up in an IMF program. We didn't. We're kind of lucky. And there was a big spending review and all this kind of stuff. And the guys in finance asked the army to bugger off out of Rathmines down to the Curragh so that we could sell the barracks in Rathmines, which is the best of... They had 6 barracks in Dublin at that time. There's now only 2. The only one that housing has been built on is Clancy Barracks, which is up the other end of Houston Station. And they're still down in Rathmines, and it's a source of great, reassurance to me that Rathmines is garrisoned against the natives. And Queen Victoria put it there for a reason. But that is just an illustration of the sheer immobility in the Irish public administration machine. Another example is the bus garages in Dublin, and the Land Development Agency, in their recent report, which is a very useful report, they lamented the fact that it was going to take forever to relocate some of the bus garages. They are tram terminals that were built for the Dublin United Tramways Company at what was then the extremity of their routes, and they're still there, including a very fine one out in Donnybrook, which is straight across the road from RTE's very, very lavish and expansive campus. And that, apparently, it's just impossible. But the government owns it. So there's something missing in land use policy, especially in Dublin, but generally around the country. And what's missing is government. All the political parties, all of them, seem to me to be in favour of building more housing, but not around here. But build more housing in the next county or the next suburb, but not here.
And Ronan, you've heard Colm there, mentioning politicians. We see Sinn Féin making big political inroads on this issue. How do you rate Eoin Ó Broin's policies, and will they be able to solve things, or would you feel like Colm that they're going to be more the same?
I mean, Owen's a thoughtful guy, and he's read and written a lot about housing. I'm not convinced, though, that the maths stack up. I'm not convinced that there's any political party, similar to what Colm was saying, that truly gets. So Owen has said recently that we need significantly more homes built per year, but then so has the Taoiseach. Taoiseach talked about a 250,000 home backlog, which is roughly right. The problem is not people saying these things, the problem is working its way through the system. So in particular, the Department of Housing and the Office of the Planning Regulator realise that significantly more homes are needed. The other concern I would have is that the numbers don't seem to be right in terms of building homes. So Sinn Féin's plan, as last I saw it, was predicated on a certain amount, a certain cost of building social housing. But I don't believe that's been matched anywhere in terms of the actual cost of building social housing. There was a report I was involved in last year for Dublin City Council, the owners of this venue, and the cost for a local authority to provide social housing is significantly above the cost it pays a private developer in Part 5. They were hoping it would be below, but it's significantly above. But if your numbers are based on it being cheaper for the local authority to build, then you're off on the wrong foot. And the last concern I'd have would be that local authorities have a conflict of interest, right? They're landowners, they're planning regulators, and they're also looking for your vote. Most European countries have non-profit housing bodies that do the social housing that are arm's length and that are protected by legal or charitable status. That'd be a much more profitable way for us, profitable is probably the wrong word, a much more useful way for us as a country to go about building non-profit housing than going back to a system which we had before, which ended up simply with the state selling off the housing in order to win votes down the road. I think you've called it, Colm, in the past, a leaky bucket. That Ireland has built as much social housing over the last century as Denmark, it just sold most of it off.
Yeah, at bargain prices. But just on the political parties and on if there was a change of government, would it make a difference? The leader of Sinn Féin represents Dublin North Central, I think it's called, which includes Croke Park and very close by the old Clonliffe Seminary.
Right. Yeah.
And if you know where it is, it stretches all the way up. It's the size of a farm. Up, you can actually see the other end of it out the back of Talca Park, so that's how big it is, and it goes up past the Archbishop's Palace and all that. I think it must be 40, 50 acres in total. But some bunch of guys bought a slice of it and tried to get permission for 1,600 residential units. And the opposition was led by the leader of Sinn Féin, who happens to be a deputy from the local area. And needless to say, she was not alone. All the politicians out there are all against it because all the residents' associations are against it.
And can I add, sorry to interrupt, Colm, their argument for opposing it was that it was predominantly 1- and 2-bed homes. And they were saying that's not the kind of homes we need. And that worries me, because they are exactly the kinds of homes we need. We have more family homes in this country than we will ever have families under any projection of the population out till the end of the century. The problem is we do not have families living in them. We are forcing younger adults and older adults to live in housing that is not fit for their needs, because we will not build 1- and 2-bed homes. 1- and 2-bed homes are more expensive to build per person, but that's the kind of housing we need. And it doesn't help when there is a site that would work and that would have delivered 1,600 homes, and then a new bit of the system, politicians effectively in alliance with the judicial system ultimately struck it down because there wasn't a plan for an old tree on the site. That's the level we're at in terms of how far behind in getting the homes needed built. Sorry to interrupt.
The same politicians will rattle on. I mean, I don't doubt their sincerity when they say, isn't it terrible people having to pay ridiculous rents and you know, new homes are too expensive for young people and so on. I don't doubt their sincerity, but they haven't joined the dots. They'll then drone on about the 15-minute city and some other fashionable town planning stuff like that. The site in Clonlive is just beside Croke Park. People drive up from the country, have a couple of pints in town, and walk to Croke Park as they walk to the Aviva Stadium. So if you believe in this 15-minute city stuff, then that was a site that should have been developed in a trice. I mentioned the barracks in Rathmines. The bus station in Donnybrook is another example, which the Land Development Agency says is a long-term project. It belongs to the state. So it seems to me that what we're up against is a NIMBYism problem, that everybody wants more housing, but they want it somewhere else. Everybody wants more wind farms, but in the Atlantic. You cannot build housing in the Atlantic.
And I think the perception on the part of policymakers is that the organisations wasting land are somewhere else. Whereas in fact, for the government broadly defined, it's in the room. Right? You are the set of organisations wasting or underusing the most valuable land. Whether it's army barracks or bus depots or train stations, there are the HSE, the OPW, CIE. The LDA exercise was really useful in taking stock of what the state in its various guises and the local authorities actually own. If we don't have a system, and there's talk of this land value sharing thing, if that's not well designed, if that's viewed as, well, the problem here is you've got private sector actors sitting on and speculating on land, and that's the problem we're trying to solve. Whereas in fact, it's a site that passed its best use 150 years ago as an army barracks. Right? If you're designing the wrong solution because you've misdiagnosed the problem, then you're not going to get the right answer out the other side. You're going to end up driving up the cost of new build homes. And actually, if you think of it as an income distribution, the viability point moves even further up the income distribution. That you're, instead of the market only being able to serve the top 30%, it's now down to the top 20% or 15% of the income distribution. But what happens to the rest? What happens to everyone else's housing need? And there's been no connection of construction costs and the income distribution in particular to see where one aligns with the other. We've talked a lot about land use policy and how we use land, but the other side of the coin is what you put on the land and how expensive it is to do that. I think that's the other big set of issues the government has to resolve.
And just to come in on something that Pascal Donoghue said recently, he said that the issue with building homes was not money, it was capacity. What do you both think are the structural issues that are actually blocking the building of homes in this country, and what can be done to address that? Like, what are the practical things you'd like to see done?
I'll just come back on the idea of capacity first, if that's okay. The capacity of the construction sector to build offices in Ireland in 2013 was zero. Right? There was not a single square metre in that sector built. By 2016, people in this room will know the numbers better than I do, but over the course of about 4 or 5 years, the number of square meters of office space that were either built, some of them were torn down and built again, but built is about somewhere between 20 and 30% of the core office space was actually added to. There is no problem with capacity when viability is there. The reason we do not have capacity in residential construction is because the numbers do not stack up. We can solve that, so going to the second part of your question, the way we solve that is not by trying to figure out necessarily, I'm not saying this is a bad idea, how do we get more people into construction at an earlier age? I certainly think we could help that process. I think globally, 25% of the construction workforce is going to retire in the next 10 years. So this is not an issue unique to Ireland. But really it comes down to what is the unit labour cost? How much does it cost to build a square metre of a home? And if you haven't done the line-by-line audit of construction costs to understand why Ireland is 30% more expensive than other small European countries, with or without taxes, if you haven't done that, then you won't be able to add to the capacity. It's not about capacity as an abstract, it's capacity as a reflection of viability.
Yeah. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, there's a kind of a tricky problem at the core of this. Some politicians keep going on saying we should have a state house building agency. And they should just go off and build houses. Actually, we have 31 house building agencies. They're called county councils, and there's 31 of them. Some of them have had their own proposals to build public housing opposed locally by their own elected members, including members of opposition parties whose hearts bleed faster for generation rent than anybody else's. The problem is that the gatekeepers for land use policy are the local authorities. And that dates back to the 1963 Planning and Development Act. And I have argued for the last number of years that it's just failed. There's a built-in conflict of interest. If you're a councillor, there are no local party political branches anymore. People have better things to do. There are residents' associations, including pop-up residents' associations that make their debut on Facebook the week after some guy has said, I'd like to build some apartments around here. And the local authority members, and I've spoken to some of them, get dogs abuse and threats and so on. And they end up opposing zoning. For land that is zoned, they will oppose planning permission, and on occasion, there was a recent example not too far away from here, where the planners approved a proposal, it got turned down by Board Planala, and some of the councillors and local politicians sided with the residents' associations. It's a political problem. Ireland is not short of land. I used to live spent a bit of time down in the Midlands the last few years. I caught the train one morning in Portlaoise station, and the station was cold and dreary, and it was winter, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and there was a couple of hundred people with Dublin accents, internally displaced people, they're called by the UN refugee outfit. And they caught the train into Dublin and scarpered off from Houston Station. But on the way, at one of the stations on the way, I think it's Kildare Town, if you looked at, and this was when the train was stopped at the station, if you looked at the left-hand carriage, there was Daisy the cow in the next field munching away. Portlaoise is, from memory, 50 miles from Dublin, which is 80 kilometres. And I checked it. 80 kilometres is actually the width of the city of Tokyo. It's about 40 or 50 kilometres deep. It has a population of 32 million. You could fit Tokyo between Dublin and Portlaoise. So these people are commuting 15-minute city, my eye. They're commuting through the places where the suburbs ought to be. And they're not there because of the local authority monopoly on zoning and then monopoly on planning permission and the impossibility of the state under that system.
Could I add to that?
Responding on the supply side.
I don't have control over the polling, right? But if I did, I'd ask people what they think has happened to Dublin's share of the population of the country over the last 60 years. Dublin has a smaller fraction of Ireland's population now than in 1961 or 1971. And yet, if you talk to a politician, they're worried about Dublin growing too big. Right? Dublin is 26%, the city of Dublin is 26%, not the council area, like the full city, is 26% of the country's population, 27% if you include Leixlip and Selbridge and Bray and a couple of other places. Right? That is small, not just as an absolute, right? It's small as a share when you're talking about small countries. Go to any other small country, the biggest city is usually 35% of the population. Go to Tallinn or Vienna or Lisbon or Stockholm or Helsinki, right? And yet we have politicians bravely fighting a problem that doesn't exist about Dublin being too big.
Yeah, and bits of Dublin are in Portlaoise, and there's other bits in Mullingar and so on. I know John Bruton fairly well, who lives down, I think John lives down Dunboyne, just beyond Dunboyne. And I bumped into him in Croke Park one day, a good few years ago now, and Meath were playing Dublin, unsuccessfully, thanks be to God. And he came up and he said, I drove down this morning, he said, with a couple of my pals, and we were the only fellas with Meath flags on the way down the road. He said they were coming from Dunshaughlin, as far away as Navan, Kells, with their blue flags to go down and cheer against County Meath. And what the figures show, as Ronan and his colleagues in Trinity are well aware because they've documented a lot of this stuff, the fastest growing counties in Ireland in the last 50 years are Meath and Kildare, followed by Wicklow. And all of these rural deputies who continually moan and bellyache about, Dublin is overdeveloped. A part of the problem is that it isn't. It's full of derelict sites and a huge unlegislated green belt out to the west and north of the city in particular. And back during the bubble period when we did build a lot of houses, with stunning targeting, we built them in Leitrim and Donegal and Mayo, which is where the ghost estates were. There were no ghost estates in Rathmines that I ever heard about. And the source of the problem is the joint responsibility of local authorities, both for land use, which they won't do because they simply don't have the political wherewithal to address it, and they're also responsible for housing. And if I had a wish, I would make land use planning a central government function. It's too easy for people to say, here in County Kildare, which is where they're doing it at the moment, we're going to de-zone land because we don't want to annoy too many residents.
At the risk of...
And they can build it in leash. Everybody, it's a pass-the-parcel nightmare under the existing arrangements. And I would take the land use planning powers away from local authorities and bring them back to central government.
I would say, myself and Colm have been agreeing on quite a bit, so I'll start disagreements and say, be careful what you wish for. We've sort of moved into a system like that over the last few years with the Office of the Planning Regulator. And I agree that most countries, the problem of having local authorities and municipalities is that there's an externality there that they will not factor in. There's the people who don't get housed that they don't have to care about because they're not the ones voting for them. Yeah. So it does make sense to try and either go a level up or internalise that somehow. The problem in Ireland is that when it went from the local authority level up to the national level with the new Office of the Planning Regulator, the targets that were set nationally were so low that local authorities that do want to build are being told they're not allowed zone. So most of the local authorities around Dublin have been told that they're not allowed allow for the number of homes they want to allow for over the next 6-7 years. And that's based on an idea which is even more concerning, which is that the central government gets to dictate who lives where. We want more people living in Leitrim and Roscommon, so therefore we will not allow Meads or Dún Laoghaire Rathdown or wherever. We've got these population projections, but we're going to shift them all. That sounds great in abstract, but in reality, who is going to get moved? Who is going to be told, I'm sorry, you're just too late, off you go, you'll have to live in Longford. This is nothing against Longford. It's if you did not want to live in Longford and you've been told you had to live in Longford. In the same way, I presume the opposite is also horrific, right? If you are from Longford and want to live in Longford and you end up down in Cork or Dublin City, that would presumably be also against your wishes. But the challenge here is that we have a national system, and the national system thinks it knows better not only than the local authorities, but than people themselves.
And what about the planning and development bill? Do you think that is going to speed up planning? I mean, there's a lot of people in the room who would like to hear that it might.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it is. People have been drawing attention to understaffing in Bord Pleanála, which is not a new problem, but it's become more acute recently. And the long delays and so on. These are a big component of cost for developments, as any builder will tell you. But there are other problems. I'll give you an example. Within a few hundred metres of here, and in Dublin too, there is a surface level car park, which is padlocked at weekends and half empty during the week. And I think it has spaces for about 40 cars. It's a surface level car park in Dublin too. Now, you don't need a degree in town planning to figure out that this is not a very high priority land use. A bunch of people got approval from the planners in Dublin Corporation and got planning permission to build a mixture of offices mostly and a few apartments on this site. And they were turned down by Bord Pleanála, not by some judge in the High Court. Now, I think some of the judicial review stuff has been ridiculous, and I hope that the new legislation will put a stop to it. But the thing was screwed up before the judges got involved, and I don't accept that the judicial review decisions, some of which are daft, have been a big factor in the overall equation. Of course, we shouldn't have judges deciding on planning issues. But if surface level car parks in Dublin too are a really cool idea, then we shouldn't have town planners involved in it either. It's just ridiculous.
What I would say, and I will defer to the experts speaking later in the day on the specifics, but if you think about this, it's an impressive feat that when they published the draft bill, nobody liked it. Right? That's quite good going. That's good sign. If the system that most countries have is either a zoning-based system, so like master plans. Like so Denmark, they say, okay, here's what we need over the next 50, 60 years, and you can update it, but we'll roll out the infrastructure and it'll be all ready to go and you can just build. And there's no uncertainty about this because everyone knows what the plan is over the next 50 years, and that's what you do. Or you have an individual project-based yes or no, right? And a lot of American cities will have that instead, where you want to do this, you go to the office and they say yes or no. In Ireland, we've managed to do both those things, right? So we try to do zoning and we try to do project-based planning permission. For me, the obvious solution is to choose one that we think is the best way to deliver social outcomes. Personally, for me, it'd be the master planning. But what we did instead, and this goes to maybe I disagree slightly with Colm, is we added a third level in the last few years. So not only do we have zoning and planning, we also have a judicial system that can step in. And there was a great hope among some residents' associations the European Court of Justice would be able to be added up the very top, that if there was something they didn't like, they could go keep going up the chain. Maybe the International Court for Arbitration in Sport might have got involved at some point as well. They keep going to find new bodies. Yeah. But it comes back to which system do we want and how do we go about delivering that? And my understanding is that was the original intention behind the bill, was to go to a more master plan zoning-based system, away from discretion on individual things, reduce the uncertainty for everyone, including the local residents, as to what's going to happen. I'm not a legal expert, but it doesn't look like that is what has come out the other side. And I think the government probably recognises from the reaction of all the different parties, all the way from developers to residents' associations, that they've got this one wrong and they're going to have to go back and make some pretty significant changes.
And we talked a lot about residential property, guys. Colm, before we came on stage, we were talking about commercial property. What do you think is the outlook there in this current environment of higher interest rates and post-COVID?
I think over the next year or two, the sector is going to face difficulties, and we still don't know what the working from home outcome is going to be, and there's been a lot of discussion internationally and a lot of surveys done and so on, but how the whole thing settles down, I just don't know. The basic point I'd always make about commercial property is that there is a market. There are stutters and screw-ups and occasional slumps, and people make money and lose money. But there isn't, people are not being told that you must build that office block in Longford, it will heal itself. With residential property, think about it this way. Before the 63 Planning and Development Act, and particularly before it began to bite, which was in the 1970s, the system we had in Dublin was the following. When the builders reckoned, I can build a few houses and I can sell them, they would drive out to places like Temple Oak and Raheny, and they'd buy a farm. And they'd buy a farm off some fella who knew damn well that they'd drive on up the road and buy the next one if he didn't sell, because there was no zoning and no restrictive planning permission. Now, I'd like you to think, what would the city of Dublin look like? What would its population be if Raheny and Temple Oak and all of those suburbs all had to be demolished tomorrow? Because they wouldn't be there under the system that we now have. Because once the builders had driven out to Temple Oak or Raheny. Raheny was farmland when I was a kid. I used to live over that side of the city. When they drove to Raheny to buy the farm off the fellow in Raheny, they would have been, no, it's not zoned. It's zoned agriculture.
I'm just conscious of
there are bits of the city of Dublin inside the M50 that are formally zoned to this day agriculture. Not many, but some.
Now, I'd like to just take one question here, and this will be our final question. Just it's from the floor. If both of the panelists, what one prediction would you both like to make about the Irish property market in the next sort of year or two?
We each get one, or we have to confer for half points.
You can agree between you, or you can go one each.
So what was the time? It was the next 3 years, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the key distinction is between residential and the rest, and I'm going to focus on residential because it's my area of expertise. For me, notwithstanding the best intentions of everyone involved, I think the next 2 to 3 years are going to be challenging because of a combination of our of external factors, the increase in the interest rates and yields, and an increase in construction costs, which is outside of our control, but also because of self-inflicted decisions. The fact that we've made a system incredibly cumbersome to build new homes. So that cumbersome system would have been there regardless, and efforts to reform it have so far not really paid that many dividends. But the external factors, I think, are going to dominate the next 2 to 3 years. So far, the commencements activity looks good for this year, and we'll probably have a reasonably high level of completions compared to the last 10 years. But to finish where I started, if we're not building 50 to 60,000 homes per year, and that's a number we need for the next 3 to 4 decades, then we're not at the races, and things are going to be getting worse rather than better. So I'm sorry, it's doom and gloom to close out.
Yeah. Colm, one prediction.
Yeah. Well, just on the outlook for that kind of short time period, there seems to be some discussion in the popular media or some expectation on behalf of some radio and TV presenters and people like that, that because interest rates have gone up, eventually they're going to come down. And the word unprecedented means there was no precedent for this. The period of negative official interest rates was unprecedented. And everybody uses the word unprecedented without thinking about what it means. I don't think it's going to happen again. The European Central Bank has been a bit slower than the Fed, for example, in pushing up rates. They were all a bit slow, and they've all kind of admitted it. They're all taken a bit by surprise by the inflation surge. They're making up for lost time. I think they will knock the inflation out of the system at some stage over the next 18, 24 months. But interest rates will not then return to where they were. So anybody who thinks that we'll be back with tracker rates at almost nothing and longer-term variable rates at much lower levels, I'm not sure that's going to happen. I think we're going back to normality, and normality will mean mortgage rates several points higher indefinitely than people had got comfortable with a few years ago.
Ronan Lyons and Colm McCarthy, on that note, we're going to end our fascinating chat. Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Mr.